Gaslighting is one of the most subtle yet psychologically devastating forms of manipulation that exists in human relationships. Unlike obvious aggression, gaslighting works quietly, slowly, and almost invisibly. It does not attack your body, your possessions, or even your reputation directly. Instead, it targets something far more fragile and far more essential to your sense of reality, your perception of what is true. The most dangerous part is that when gaslighting is working, you usually don't realize it is happening. You simply begin to feel confused, then uncertain, then anxious. Eventually, you start wondering if something is wrong with you. Gaslighting makes you question your memory, your interpretation of events, your emotional reactions, and eventually your sanity. The manipulator rarely needs to shout or threaten. Their weapon is doubt, and doubt, when applied repeatedly and strategically, can slowly dismantle a person's confidence in their own mind. Gaslighting makes you believe the problem is you. That is the hook. That is the trap. That is the psychological architecture behind one of the most powerful manipulation tactics ever used in relationships, workplaces, families, and even large social systems. To understand why gaslighting works, we first need to understand a basic psychological truth. Humans rely heavily on cognitive stability. Your brain constantly builds a coherent narrative about reality. Every experience, conversation, and memory becomes part of that internal map. This map tells you what happened, who you can trust, and how the world works. Without that internal map, decision making becomes extremely difficult. Imagine waking up every day unsure whether your memories from yesterday are accurate. Imagine constantly second guessing whether conversations happen the way you remember them. Imagine feeling uncertain about your emotional reactions because someone keeps telling you that you are overreacting, misremembering, or imagining things. That instability creates psychological stress. Your brain hates unresolved contradictions. When reality and someone else's version of events conflict, your mind tries to resolve the tension. And this is exactly where gaslighting becomes effective. A manipulator introduces small contradictions into your perception of reality. At first, they seem insignificant. A comment like, "I never said that," or "you're remembering it wrong," or "you're too sensitive." On the surface, these statements seem harmless. Everyone misremembers things occasionally. Everyone has moments of emotional overreaction. So when a manipulator challenges your memory once or twice, you might dismiss it as a normal misunderstanding. But gaslighting is never about one isolated moment. It is about repetition. It is about patterns. It is about slowly shifting your confidence away from your own perception and toward the manipulator's version of reality. The manipulator begins by planting seeds of doubt. Then they reinforce those seeds through confusion. Over time, confusion turns into dependence, and dependence gives the manipulator control. One of the earliest signs of gaslighting is subtle memory invalidation. You remember a conversation clearly, but the other person denies it happened the way you recall. You say something like, "Yesterday you said you would handle that situation." They respond calmly, almost casually, "No, I never said that. You must have misunderstood." At first you might push back. You might insist that you remember it correctly. But if this happens repeatedly, something interesting begins to occur in your mind. Your brain starts performing a cost-benefit analysis. Arguing requires energy. Defending your memory requires certainty. But uncertainty is exactly what the manipulator is manufacturing. When the same contradiction appears again and again, your brain begins to ask a question that becomes the turning point in gaslighting dynamics. What if they are right? Once that question appears, the psychological terrain shifts dramatically. Because now the manipulator no longer needs to prove anything. Your own mind begins doing the work for them. Instead of trusting your recollection automatically, you start hesitating. You start replaying memories in your head. You start wondering whether you misinterpreted the tone of a conversation. You begin mentally editing your own experiences before expressing them. And this is the first stage of cognitive destabilization. Cognitive destabilization means your mental framework for interpreting reality becomes unreliable in your own eyes. The manipulator has not changed reality. They have changed your confidence in your ability to recognize reality. That difference is critical because once someone loses trust in their perception, they start looking for external validation to fill the gap. And who becomes the primary source of that validation? The manipulator themselves. This is where gaslighting becomes deeply strategic. The manipulator alternates between denial and reassurance. One moment they challenge your memory. The next moment they present themselves as the calm, rational voice in the situation. They might say something like, "I think you're just stressed lately. You've been forgetting things. Or you're overthinking again. Relax, everything is fine." Notice the subtle psychological move happening here. The manipulator is not just denying your perception. They are redefining your identity. Instead of being someone with valid experiences, you are gradually framed as someone who is forgetful, emotional, dramatic, or confused. Identity framing is one of the most powerful tools in psychological manipulation. Once a person starts seeing themselves through a negative label, their behavior begins to conform to that label. If someone convinces you that you are forgetful, every small memory mistake suddenly becomes evidence. If someone convinces you that you are too emotional, every strong feeling becomes proof of instability. Over time, you begin self-policing your own reactions. Instead of saying "that hurt me," you think "maybe I'm being too sensitive." Instead of saying "you promised this," you think "maybe I misunderstood." Gaslighting thrives in environments where emotional trust exists. This is why it most often appears in close relationships, romantic partners, family members, long-term friendships, or authority figures in workplaces. The manipulator uses that trust as camouflage. When a stranger contradicts you aggressively, your brain raises alarms. But when someone you trust gently questions your memory, your brain becomes cooperative rather than defensive. This is one reason why victims of gaslighting often defend the manipulator to outsiders. From the outside, the behavior might look obvious. Friends might say that person is manipulating you. But from inside the psychological fog created by gaslighting, the situation feels much more ambiguous. Because the manipulator rarely behaves cruelly all the time, they mix kindness with confusion. They mix affection with denial. This creates emotional whiplash that makes it extremely difficult to interpret their intentions clearly. Confusion is not a side effect of gaslighting. Confusion is the strategy. When your brain cannot clearly categorize someone as safe or dangerous, it stays engaged trying to solve the puzzle. That cognitive engagement keeps you psychologically attached to the manipulator. You spend hours replaying conversations, analyzing tone, searching for hidden meanings. Your mental energy becomes absorbed by the relationship dynamic, and the more energy you invest, the harder it becomes to step away. Another powerful component of gaslighting is what psychologists call reality erosion. Reality erosion occurs when repeated contradictions gradually weaken your sense of certainty about what you experienced. Imagine writing something on a whiteboard and then slowly erasing it a little bit each day. The words are still there, but they become faint. Eventually, you start questioning whether they were written clearly in the first place. Gaslighting performs that same erasure process on your memory. Each time the manipulator denies an event, minimizes your feelings, or reframes a situation, they remove a small piece of confidence from your perception. The change is so gradual that you rarely notice it happening. One day you simply realize that you asked the manipulator for confirmation before trusting your own interpretation of events. That moment represents a shift in psychological authority. Your internal compass has been replaced by an external one controlled by someone else. At this stage, victims often experience a strange emotional state, chronic self-doubt combined with growing dependency. They feel less capable of interpreting situations independently, yet they feel increasingly tied to the person who destabilized them. This paradox is exactly what makes gaslighting so difficult to escape. The manipulator becomes both the source of confusion and the perceived source of clarity. When conflict arises, the victim seeks resolution from the same person who created the distortion in the first place. To understand why this works so well, consider how humans process social reality. Much of what we believe about events comes from shared confirmation. If three people remember something happening, the memory feels stable. But if someone insists strongly that your memory is wrong, especially someone emotionally close to you, your brain experiences what psychologists call social dissonance. Social dissonance occurs when your internal perception conflicts with the perception presented by someone you trust. Humans are wired to resolve this tension by aligning with the group or the trusted person rather than insisting on individual certainty. Gaslighters exploit this tendency. They position themselves as the stable interpreter of reality while portraying you as unreliable. And because humans value social harmony, many victims unconsciously surrender their certainty to preserve the relationship. Over time, this surrender becomes habitual. You stop asserting what you remember. You start asking questions instead of making statements. Did that happen the way I think it did? Am I remembering that correctly? Those questions signal that the gaslighting process has successfully shifted your psychological stance from confident witness to uncertain participant in your own life. At this point, many people begin experiencing anxiety without understanding the cause. They feel mentally exhausted after conversations. They replay interactions repeatedly, trying to verify what was real. They worry about making mistakes in communication because they fear being told again that they misunderstood something. This constant monitoring of your own cognition is draining. Your brain is working overtime to maintain a stable narrative, but the manipulator keeps disrupting the narrative every time it begins to settle. This creates a chronic state of cognitive fatigue. Cognitive fatigue makes people more suggestible. When your mental resources are depleted, you are less likely to challenge contradictions aggressively. Instead, you accept the simplest explanation available. And the manipulator is always ready with one. You misheard. You misunderstood. You're too emotional. You're imagining things. You're overreacting again. Gradually, these explanations stop feeling like accusations and start feeling like facts. The most alarming part is that gaslighting does not require sophisticated psychological training. Many manipulators learn these tactics intuitively because they notice the effects they produce. If denying something helps them avoid accountability, they repeat the denial. If questioning someone's memory ends an argument faster, they continue doing it. Over time, these behaviors evolve into a consistent manipulation pattern. Some gaslighters are highly strategic and aware of what they are doing. Others simply know that confusion gives them control without fully understanding the psychological mechanisms behind it. But the outcome is the same. The victim begins to lose trust in their own mind. And once that trust erodes, the manipulator gains enormous influence over the narrative of reality. The next stage of gaslighting often involves emotional minimization. When you express discomfort, the manipulator reframes your reaction as irrational. They might say you're making a big deal out of nothing or you're always so dramatic. Notice how this technique works on two levels simultaneously. First, it dismisses the specific concern you raised. Second, it attaches a negative personality trait to your reaction. Now you are not just wrong about the event, you are flawed as a person for feeling the way you do. This creates a powerful internal conflict. Humans want to maintain a positive self-image. When someone repeatedly links your emotions with negative labels, you begin adjusting your behavior to avoid those labels. You suppress concerns. You downplay your own experiences. You become quieter during disagreements. And each time you do that, the manipulator gains more narrative control over the relationship dynamic. Gaslighting is ultimately about narrative dominance. Whoever controls the story of what happened controls the emotional interpretation of the event. If the manipulator defines the story as you misunderstood, then your feelings become invalid. If they define the story as you're too sensitive, then your reaction becomes the problem rather than their behavior. Over months or years, this narrative rewriting can reshape how someone sees themselves entirely. People who were once confident in their perception may begin describing themselves as forgetful, emotional, or unstable simply because those labels have been repeated so often. That transformation is not accidental. It is the psychological endpoint gaslighting moves toward. When someone fully internalizes those labels, they stop challenging the manipulator altogether. They assume confusion is their natural state. They assume the manipulator's interpretation must be more accurate. And in that moment, the gaslighter has achieved the ultimate form of manipulation, control over another person's perception of reality without needing to enforce it through force or threat. The victim participates in maintaining the illusion because they no longer trust their own perspective enough to resist it. And all of it started with something that seemed small: a denied statement, a questioned memory, a casual comment suggesting you misunderstood. That is how gaslighting begins. Quietly, subtly, almost invisibly. And by the time the pattern becomes obvious, the psychological foundation of certainty may already be deeply shaken. As gaslighting continues over time, something deeper begins to happen inside the mind of the person experiencing it. The confusion that started as occasional doubt slowly becomes a background state of psychological instability. At first, the contradictions felt strange, but manageable. Now they begin to feel exhausting. You find yourself constantly trying to verify reality in small ways. You replay conversations in your mind while driving, lying in bed, or walking alone. You wonder whether you misheard something, whether you interpreted a tone incorrectly, or whether you reacted too strongly to a situation that maybe was not as serious as it felt in the moment. The strange part is that you may still remember events clearly. Your memory might actually be intact, but your confidence in that memory has been slowly eroded. And when confidence disappears, certainty collapses even if the information itself remains. This is the heart of cognitive destabilization. Gaslighting does not necessarily erase your memories. Instead, it makes those memories feel unreliable. Imagine standing on solid ground but being told repeatedly that the floor beneath you might collapse at any moment. Eventually, you start walking differently. You move more carefully. You hesitate before every step. The ground did not change, but your trust in it did. That is exactly what happens to the mind under sustained gaslighting. The person begins to treat their own perception like unstable terrain. They become cautious about expressing certainty. They second-guess statements that once would have felt obvious. They develop a habit of checking with the manipulator before trusting their own interpretation of events. And when that habit forms, the balance of psychological power in the relationship shifts dramatically, because now the manipulator becomes the unofficial authority on reality. One of the most powerful tools used during this stage is manipulation through confusion. Confusion is not simply a byproduct of conflict. In gaslighting dynamics, confusion is deliberately cultivated. The manipulator often mixes contradictory messages in the same interaction. They might deny something that happened, then moments later acknowledge part of it in a different way. They might apologize for hurting you while simultaneously insisting the event you are describing never actually occurred. This creates a cognitive loop in the victim's mind. Your brain tries to assemble the conversation into a coherent narrative, but the pieces do not fit together cleanly. When humans encounter contradictions, they instinctively attempt to resolve them. The mind hates unresolved puzzles, but the manipulator keeps adding new contradictions before the previous ones can settle. This creates a state known as cognitive overload. When cognitive overload occurs, the brain's ability to analyze situations logically becomes weaker. Instead of calmly evaluating evidence, the mind searches for the quickest explanation that reduces tension. And the easiest explanation is often the one offered by the manipulator. They might say something like, "You're mixing things up again," or "You always twist what I say." When your brain is overwhelmed, those explanations start feeling plausible simply because they provide closure. The confusion ends temporarily when you accept their narrative. This pattern trains the victim to surrender their interpretation more quickly each time a conflict arises. Over time, this creates a subtle but powerful behavioral shift. Instead of presenting your memory as a fact, you begin presenting it as a possibility. You might say, "I think you said this yesterday, but maybe I'm wrong." That small change in language signals a deeper psychological transformation. Your internal authority is weakening. Another critical component during this phase is emotional redirection. When someone confronts a manipulator about something that happened, the manipulator often changes the focus of the conversation. Instead of addressing the event, they focus on the emotional reaction of the person raising the concern. For example, you might say, "You promised to do this," and it didn't happen. The manipulator responds not by discussing the promise but by analyzing your reaction. They might say, "Why are you always attacking me?" Or, "You're getting upset over nothing again." Notice what just happened in that interaction. The original issue has disappeared. Now the conversation revolves around your emotional response instead of the manipulator's behavior. This tactic serves two purposes simultaneously. First, it avoids accountability. Second, it reinforces the idea that your reactions are irrational or exaggerated. If this happens repeatedly, the victim begins anticipating the emotional redirection before it even occurs. They might think twice before bringing up concerns because they expect the conversation will somehow turn into criticism of their behavior instead. Gradually, the person starts silencing themselves. They stop pointing out contradictions. They stop insisting on clarity. They stop asking difficult questions. Silence becomes a defense mechanism. But that silence also removes the last obstacle to the manipulator's control over the narrative. Another layer of gaslighting involves strategic memory reframing. The manipulator does not only deny events. Sometimes they acknowledge the event but change its meaning. You might say, "You insulted me during that conversation." Instead of denying the words, the manipulator reframes the context. They might say, "I was joking," "You're taking it too seriously," or "I was trying to help you improve." This reframing technique changes the emotional interpretation of the event without changing the event itself. Your memory remains intact, but the meaning of the memory becomes contested. Humans rely heavily on shared interpretation to determine whether something was harmful or harmless. If someone insists that a hurtful comment was actually a joke or constructive criticism, your brain begins searching for evidence to support that reinterpretation. You start asking yourself whether maybe you did overreact, whether maybe you misunderstood the intention. That doubt once again moves the psychological authority away from your perception and toward the manipulator's explanation. Over time, the victim begins to adopt the manipulator's interpretations automatically. Instead of labeling behavior as disrespectful, they call it miscommunication. Instead of calling something manipulation, they call it stress or misunderstanding. Language begins to soften around the manipulator's behavior. And that softened language makes the behavior harder to confront. Gaslighting also becomes stronger when it interacts with normal human memory limitations. Human memory is not perfect. Everyone forgets details. Everyone misremembers small aspects of events occasionally. Gaslighters exploit this reality. When a victim misremembers even a minor detail, the manipulator exaggerates the significance of that mistake. They might say, "See, you do this all the time. Your memory is terrible." The victim may only have been wrong about a small part of the story, but the manipulator uses that mistake as proof that the entire memory cannot be trusted. This is a cognitive distortion technique. It takes a tiny inaccuracy and expands it into a global conclusion about someone's reliability. After hearing this repeatedly, the victim begins to fear making memory mistakes. They become hyper-aware of every detail they recall. They hesitate before sharing memories because they worry about being corrected again. Eventually, they rely more heavily on the manipulator to confirm what happened. At that point, the manipulation has achieved something extremely powerful. The victim begins outsourcing their memory verification to the very person who is distorting it. This is where psychological dependency deepens significantly. When someone feels uncertain about reality, they instinctively look for stable reference points. In healthy relationships, people help each other clarify misunderstandings. But in gaslighting relationships, the manipulator positions themselves as the only reliable interpreter of events. The victim starts asking questions like, "Did that conversation happen the way I remember? Or was I being unreasonable earlier?" Each time the manipulator answers those questions, they reinforce their authority over the narrative. And because the victim is already doubting themselves, they are more likely to accept whatever answer is given. This dynamic also creates emotional isolation. Victims of gaslighting often hesitate to discuss their experiences with outsiders because the story feels confusing even to them. They might start explaining a situation to a friend, and stop halfway through because they suddenly wonder whether they remembered it correctly. The uncertainty undermines their confidence in telling the story. Some manipulators actively encourage this isolation by suggesting that outsiders would not understand the situation. They might say things like our relationship is complicated or people would twist the story if you told them. This discourages the victim from seeking external perspectives that might restore clarity. Without outside input, the manipulator's version of events becomes even more dominant. Another important psychological shift occurs during the stage, internalized self-monitoring. The victim begins constantly evaluating their own thoughts and reactions. Instead of experiencing emotions naturally, they analyze whether those emotions are valid before expressing them. A simple feeling like frustration becomes a mental debate. Am I upset for a good reason, or am I overreacting again? This internal debate can happen dozens of times each day. The person becomes their own psychological gatekeeper, filtering thoughts and feelings before they reach the surface. While this might seem like self-awareness, it is actually a symptom of destabilization. The mind has learned that expressing certainty about perception leads to conflict, so it tries to avoid conflict by questioning itself first. Over time, this creates mental exhaustion. The brain is doing double work, experiencing life and constantly auditing its own interpretation of life. This chronic self-doubt can lead to anxiety, difficulty concentrating, and emotional numbness. Some victims begin describing a strange sensation as if they are losing connection with their own intuition. They say things like, I don't trust my instincts anymore, or I feel like I can't tell what's real. That statement captures the psychological damage gaslighting creates. Instinct and perception are deeply connected. When perception is repeatedly invalidated, instinct loses its foundation. Without that foundation, decision-making becomes extremely difficult. Even simple choices may feel overwhelming because the person fears making the wrong interpretation again. During this phase, the manipulator often introduces another tactic called selective validation. Occasionally, they agree with the victim's perception in a way that seems supportive. They might say, yes, you're right about that. These moments feel relieving. They temporarily restore a sense of clarity. But this validation is not consistent. It appears unpredictably. The inconsistency keeps the victim emotionally engaged, hoping for more moments of agreement. This pattern is similar to variable reward systems in psychology. When positive reinforcement appears randomly rather than consistently, it becomes more addictive. The victim keeps searching for those moments when the manipulator acknowledges their perspective. But because the manipulator controls when validation appears, they maintain power over the emotional dynamic. One of the most revealing signs that someone is experiencing gaslighting is the language they begin using about themselves. Instead of speaking with certainty, they frequently use phrases like, maybe I'm remembering wrong, I might be overthinking, or I could be too sensitive. These phrases appear even when the person is describing events that would normally feel very clear. That language reflects an internalized narrative, the belief that their mind is not trustworthy. And once that belief takes root, the manipulator no longer needs to contradict every event directly. The victim will often undermine their own perception automatically before the manipulator even speaks. At this point, gaslighting has evolved from external manipulation into internal psychological conditioning. The victim has learned to doubt themselves reflexively. They censor their own certainty. They reinterpret their own emotions as potential errors. And the manipulator simply reinforces those doubts occasionally to keep the system running. What began as small contradictions has now become a self-sustaining cycle of uncertainty. The mind of the victim is constantly scanning for mistakes in its own perception. And as long as that scanning continues, the manipulator remains the silent authority over what is considered real. By the time gaslighting reaches its later stages, the psychological effects are no longer subtle. The confusion that once appeared occasionally has now become a constant mental atmosphere. The person experiencing it often feels like they are living inside a fog where every memory, reaction, and interpretation must be double-checked before it can be trusted. What makes this stage particularly disturbing is that the victim may still appear functional from the outside. They go to work, maintain conversations, and continue normal routines. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. The trust between the mind and its own perception has been damaged. And when that trust is damaged, a person begins to experience reality in a fundamentally unstable way. One of the most common internal experiences during this stage is the feeling of losing confidence in your own mind. This does not necessarily mean someone believes they are going insane. Instead, it feels like a persistent background uncertainty. You might remember an event clearly but hesitate before stating it as fact. You might feel hurt by something but pause to question whether that feeling is justified. You might recall a promise someone made but find yourself wondering whether you misunderstood the wording or tone. Every internal signal that once guided your understanding of the world becomes suspect, and this creates a strange paradox. The victim begins to rely even more heavily on the person who caused the confusion in the first place. Because when your own perception feels unreliable, you naturally look for someone who appears confident and certain. Gaslighters often present themselves exactly that way. They speak calmly. They repeat their version of events with absolute certainty. They appear rational while portraying the other person as emotional or confused. This contrast strengthens their credibility in the eyes of the victim. Even when the victim feels something is wrong, the manipulator's confidence creates doubt. The mind begins asking a dangerous question again and again. What if they are right and I am the one misinterpreting everything? This question becomes the psychological anchor that keeps the gaslighting cycle alive. Another important development during this stage is identity erosion. Earlier in the process, the manipulator attached labels to the victim's reaction such as forgetful, sensitive, dramatic, or confused. At first, those labels felt unfair, but after hearing them repeatedly over time, something begins to change. The victim may start using the same labels to describe themselves. They might say things like, I know my memory isn't great, or I tend to overreact sometimes. What began as external accusation slowly becomes internal self-description. Identity erosion is extremely powerful because identity influences behavior. If someone believes they are forgetful, they become less confident asserting their memory. If someone believes they are overly emotional, they suppress their feelings before expressing them. If someone believes they misinterpret situations often, they stop trusting their instincts entirely. In this way, the manipulator no longer needs to challenge every perception directly. The victim now performs much of the self-doubt automatically. Their internal dialogue begins mirroring the manipulator's voice. This internalization is one of the most dangerous consequences of long-term gaslighting because it continues affecting the victim even when the manipulator is not present. A person may leave the relationship physically but still carry the mental patterns that were created within it. They may continue doubting their memory, questioning their emotions, and assuming they are misunderstanding situations even in new relationships where no manipulation exists. That is why gaslighting can have such long-lasting psychological effects. It reshapes how a person interprets their own thoughts. However, there is an important moment that often appears near the end of the gaslighting cycle. It does not always happen suddenly, but when it does, it can feel like waking up from a long period of confusion. This moment begins with a small realization that something about the pattern of events does not make sense. The victim might notice that the contradictions always seem to benefit the same person. Promises disappear when accountability is required. Memories become inaccurate only when they expose harmful behavior. Emotional reactions are called irrational only when they challenge the manipulator. When someone starts noticing this pattern, a shift begins to occur. Instead of analyzing each event individually, they begin analyzing the pattern of interactions as a whole. And when the entire pattern becomes visible, the manipulation becomes harder to ignore. The victim might start remembering earlier moments that once seemed minor but now appear suspicious. Conversations where their memory was dismissed. Situations where their feelings were minimized. Instances where events were reframed in ways that always removed responsibility from the manipulator. These memories begin forming a coherent picture, and for the first time in a long time, the victim may feel a small spark of clarity returning. This clarity often brings a powerful emotional response. Some people feel anger when they realize how their perception was manipulated. Others feel grief because they trusted someone who repeatedly distorted reality. Some feel embarrassment for not recognizing the pattern earlier. But one emotion often appears alongside all the others: relief. Relief because the constant uncertainty finally begins to make sense. The confusion was not a personal flaw. It was the result of repeated psychological interference. Understanding this does not instantly repair the damage, but it restores something extremely important: the possibility that your perception might actually be trustworthy again. Rebuilding trust in your own perception takes time because the habit of self-doubt has been reinforced for so long. The brain has learned to question itself automatically. Reversing that habit requires slowly practicing something that once felt natural but now feels unfamiliar: believing your own experience. This does not mean assuming every memory is perfect or every reaction is flawless. Human perception will always have imperfections. But healthy self-trust means allowing your experiences to exist without immediately discrediting them. It means acknowledging that your emotions often carry valid information about how you are being treated. One helpful step in this process is external reality confirmation. When someone begins recovering from gaslighting, discussing events with neutral and trustworthy people can help restore confidence in perception. When multiple people confirm that a situation seems manipulative or inconsistent, it challenges the narrative that the victim is simply misinterpreting everything. This external feedback acts like a stabilizing force for the mind. It reminds the brain that perception is not an isolated system. Humans evolved to interpret reality collectively. When someone has been trapped in a closed environment where only one person defines the narrative, reintroducing outside perspectives can restore balance. Another crucial step is recognizing the difference between normal memory errors and systematic reality distortion. Everyone forgets details occasionally. Everyone misremembers things sometimes. But gaslighting is not about occasional mistakes. It is about repeated contradictions that consistently shift responsibility away from one person while undermining the credibility of another. When someone learns to recognize that pattern, they become far less vulnerable to it in the future. Instead of focusing on proving individual memories perfectly, they pay attention to the structure of interactions. Does the other person accept responsibility when they are wrong, or do they constantly redirect blame? Do disagreements lead to honest discussion, or do they lead to accusations that you are confused or irrational? These patterns reveal far more about manipulation than any single memory ever could. One of the most empowering realizations people have after escaping gaslighting is understanding that confusion was never evidence of weakness. Confusion was the intended psychological outcome of the manipulation. The gaslighter needed confusion to maintain control over the narrative. If the victim had remained fully confident in their perception, the manipulation would have collapsed much earlier. This realization changes how the victim sees their past reactions. What once looked like personal failure begins to look like a normal human response to sustained psychological pressure. Anyone placed in an environment where their perception is repeatedly challenged would experience doubt eventually. Recognizing this allows the person to release some of the shame that often accompanies gaslighting experiences. Shame thrives on the belief that you should have known better, but manipulation rarely looks obvious while it is happening. It works precisely because it unfolds gradually. Small contradictions appear harmless at first. Emotional minimization feels like a misunderstanding. Memory disputes seem like ordinary disagreements. Only when the entire pattern is visible does the manipulation become clear. And by that time, the victim's perception has already been weakened by months or years of doubt. The most important step after recognizing gaslighting is rebuilding internal authority. Internal authority means trusting that your perception has value even when someone else challenges it. It means recognizing that disagreement does not automatically mean you are mistaken. Healthy relationships allow two people to remember events differently without attacking each other's sanity or intelligence. When someone repeatedly insists that your perception is invalid, that is not healthy disagreement. That is psychological domination disguised as correction. Rebuilding internal authority often involves reconnecting with instincts that were suppressed during the gaslighting process. Many victims recall that early in the relationship they felt something was off, but dismissed the feeling because the manipulator offered convincing explanations. Learning to listen to those early signals again can restore confidence in your intuition. Intuition is not mystical. It is the brain's ability to recognize patterns quickly based on past experiences. Gaslighting interrupts that pattern recognition by constantly forcing the mind to reinterpret signals. When the manipulation ends, intuition slowly returns as the brain relearns to trust its own observations. Over time, the fog created by gaslighting begins to lift. Conversations become easier to interpret because no one is deliberately introducing contradictions. Emotional reactions feel clearer because they are no longer dismissed or reframed constantly. Decisions become simpler because the mind no longer needs to verify every perception with someone who might distort it. The person may still carry scars from the experience, but they also gain something valuable, a deeper understanding of how psychological manipulation operates. That awareness becomes a form of protection. When someone encounters similar tactics in the future, the patterns feel familiar rather than confusing. Statements like "you're imagining things" or "you're remembering that wrong" trigger caution instead of doubt. The person begins recognizing when someone is attempting to control the narrative of reality rather than discuss it honestly. In that sense, surviving gaslighting can eventually strengthen psychological boundaries. But none of that changes the fundamental truth at the center of this manipulation tactic. Gaslighting works because it attacks the most intimate relationship a person has, the relationship between their mind and their perception of reality. When someone interferes with that relationship repeatedly, confusion is inevitable. Doubt becomes unavoidable. But confusion does not mean the manipulator was right. Doubt does not mean your perception was broken. It only means your mind was responding to a strategy designed to destabilize it. And once you understand that strategy, the most powerful step you can take is simple but profound. You begin trusting your perception again. Not perfectly, not arrogantly, but with the quiet confidence that your experiences deserve to exist without someone constantly rewriting them. Because the moment you reclaim that trust, the entire mechanism of gaslighting collapses. The manipulator loses the ability to define reality for you, and the story of what happened finally returns to the person who experienced it.